My next guest in this series is a professional medical health and science writer from New York City by the name of Michael Mannion. Michael has been a professional writer for 25 years. In 1998, he came up with a book titled Project Mindshift, which I, for one, consider to be probably the single most authoritative book on the subject of UFOs and the alien presence that I have ever read. The book is objective, it's thorough, it's honest. I've written a number of adjectives to describe this thing. It's stimulating, powerful, challenging, and there are parts of it that I consider absolutely brilliant. It's my honor and my pleasure to welcome to this series, the series I call UFO Insiders, Michael Mannion. Michael,
Great
nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Now let's begin. I got a lot of things to talk about here
Okay.
today and many things to ask you. How long have you been interested in this phenomenon?
I guess I've been interested for about 30 years.
30 years?
30 years when I was a college student. And it was actually the study of life energy that brought me into contact with the UFO phenomenon. And I didn't expect that when I began that study. I was studying what we now call complementary or alternative medicine. I was studying a form of energy medicine. And as I followed the progress of that through one particular thinker, Wilhelm Reich, it led me to surprisingly, to the UFO phenomenon itself.
Well, you've done some thorough homework, and I admire that. One of the things that I have always had a little patience with are the critics and the debunkers and the skeptics who've never bothered to ever really do any research in the subject. And it's refreshing to me to have someone like you who is a professional writer that's looked at this thing and for the first time has taken an overall, what I call a historical overview, and looked at it honestly and objectively.
Well, I tried to look at the bigger picture because it is a serious topic, but it's too often covered through fiction or science fiction or comedy, or it's made fun of and made to appear goofy somehow. But yet it involves, I feel it involves the very core of life itself, and that it's an extremely serious subject, and it's part of an evolutionary process that we're going through. And so in the book, what I hope I've accomplished is to be a true skeptic, which is an open-minded seeker.
It's an honest
of the
place to
truth.
start, yeah.
Right. And so the feeling of the book for the reader is it's not a book that tells the person what to think. What I've tried to do is give the spectrum of opinion from a number of people who have been investigating this field for a long time to show that it's a serious subject, that there are serious people with differing points of view, all agreeing that it's a real phenomenon, and give the reader information so that he or she can make up her own mind. And really the goal of the book is to help you think for yourself.
Well, I think you've done a fine job of that. That's the one thing I took from it that impressed me, and I've been hyping your book now.
Well, I appreciate that.
For at least 2 years.
I appreciate that.
Every time I go to a conference and I speak, as I may have shared with you last night, I prepared a recommended reading list. I have no patience with people who don't do their homework. Now, people have a right to an opinion, But when they voice an opinion and they're skeptical and they even go into the realm of being a debunker, and yet they've never done their research and their homework, I have no patience with that. I guess the old command sergeant major that's in me, you know, I'm ready to punch them out or grab them by the shirt or something. But I am honored and pleased that you've done such a thorough job. And I'm going to push this and push this.
Well, thank you.
And I understand that this is now coming out in paperback.
Yes, it's just a couple of months ago it came out in a paperback, and so I think it did well enough in hardcover. And it seems to be a kind of book that's has a life of its own. What do they say in Broadway theater? It has legs.
Yeah.
So it seems I get calls to do radio shows, and the publishers get letters, and it seems to really be taking a hold. And I was pleased that when the book is available in bookstores and it's in the general nonfiction section,
It sells out.
it sells out. And that was my hope, was that people who may not have given this subject much thought at all might be interested in this look at it, and then they would come to see that it's a very important subject.
Well, I don't know how much you know about my background. I mean, we've shared a few things at dinner last night, but when I first got into this thing, I was a skeptic. I was not really convinced of anything. Once I really began to research it, and I've been into this thing now for well over 30 years, Michael, I've concluded that this is not only the greatest story of our time, but very likely the greatest issue in the history of the human race. Yet this issue, this phenomenon, what it means, the implications of it, are going to change our world forever.
Well, I think when it becomes known to the large number of people on Earth that we're not alone and that we're actually probably part of a cosmic community, there won't be anything that remains the same as it is today.
Oh, nothing will ever remain the same.
And it's, you know, it's in my studies as a younger person, one of the things that struck me was that this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, I focused on what's called the modern era because most people are aware of that now. But this story of life beyond Earth is one of the oldest stories in human history. And you can go back thousands and thousands of years in almost every culture, and you find people have been asking and sometimes answering these questions in the affirmative as to whether we're alone or not. You find Native American myths where people feel that their tribe was seeded from other stars, or an African tribe. I think the Dogon feel that they were seeded from the star Sirius. And the great ancient Greek philosophers all believed that it was absurd to think that life existed only on our planet, and most of them believed that while there wasn't life on every heavenly body, that certainly there was life on many of them. And you can follow this train of thought from antiquity up to the present. So it's a fascinating topic.
Well, once you get involved with it, it grabs you and it won't let you go. That's what's happened to me. I remember when I first ran into a series of slides from a French researcher many years ago, Leroy Goret, and he had gone into some of the caves in the south of France and northern Spain. And in some of these caves, the drawings on the side of the caves, and some of those drawings are masterpieces. They're beautifully done. There are pictures of UFOs. And I mean, they're as clear and as vivid and as obvious as they can be. These have been dated over 20,000 years. Now, when you stop to think about that goes back quite a while.
It does, and I think it was Greenwood and Fawcett in their book Clear Intent who mentioned that there was a book the Air Force was using until it was discovered. They were using it, Introductory Space Science, and there was a chapter on UFOs. And while the Air Force was telling the public that this was hoaxes and misidentifications.
They were teaching the cadets what really was
right,
going on.
And one of the things they were teaching them was that the UFO phenomenon is apparently global and has been going on possibly for 50,000 years.
I'm convinced of it, and I think maybe it may go back even farther than that. I think not only is it the greatest story never told, but I think that the UFO phenomenon itself, if it were just the fact that we're being visited by intelligences from somewhere else, coming here in little ships of one kind or another, if it was just that aspect of it, I think the story would have been released many, many years ago. But as you have learned, and I learned over the years, there's more to it than that. When you really begin to dig into it, you find out that this has implications about the origin of the human species. And I've read most everything Zecharia Sitchin has written, and I know you're familiar with his work. And Sitchin has clearly stated that we are very likely a hybrid species, that we're genetically manipulated, maybe 100,000 years ago at least, into being what we are, Homo sapiens. And when you get into an area like that, you're treading on some rather difficult areas.
Oh, we definitely are. But lately there is knowledge coming from paleontology and from the mainstream science that's studying our human ancient history from 30, 40, 50,000 years ago. And that's starting to sound very much like Zecharia Sitchin and others in the field of ufology. And to me, that's very exciting when you find information put together by serious researchers from different disciplines, and they all start to dovetail.
Oh, they all come together, yeah. You know, Zecharia is not the only one that's written on that area. He's the most famous. There's a brilliant scientist in England by the name of Christian O'Brien that's written a series of books on the very same thing. He translates cuneiform. And I have a couple of his books, and they tell essentially the same story. You know what interests me, however, is that the implications with religion, this is a sensitive area. And I think that's one of the things our government has addressed from the very beginning. When you consider that the human race, and perhaps every major religion on the planet, has its origins in some way with these visitors, that gets into some delicate ground.
Well, I was just on the radio yesterday morning, and this topic came up, and all of our religions at the core are actually basically the same. They teach the same values.
The same basic philosophy.
That that we're one, that we're one family, and that we must, care for one another and help one another, and that in one way or another, love is the primal force of the universe.
That's the bottom line, as they say.
And yet, there's an old Buddhist saying, everyone knows the soft overcomes the hard, and the weak the strong, but nobody knows how to live it. And in our world, the religious conflicts and the political conflicts prevent people from living the truths of their various faiths or their various ethical beliefs.
One of the things that I have disliked and spoken out very honestly about is the term alien. I don't like that word. The word alien to me divides people. It's a very divisive term. And you talk about they're aliens. Well, who the hell is alien? You know, we talk about Mexicans who come across the border illegally as being aliens. The idea of a word alien is us and them kind of thing. It divides people.
And that is, that's our MO, unfortunately, in many ways. In the book, I tried to use non-human intelligence as sort of a neutral
That's a good
term. And
that's a broad term. It applies, I think.
Since we certainly, if there's anything that we can agree on, it's that most of the phenomenon is unknown. And I thought it would help me avoid being like one of the blind men in the parable of the blind man and the elephant. One's holding the tusk, and he thinks that's the elephant, and the other's holding the tail, and he thinks that's the elephant. But we do know they're non-human, and we do know that there's an intelligence behind the phenomenon.
You know, over the years, we've learned a great deal about them. As a matter of fact, in my latest presentation in San Jose, I changed the subject of my presentation. I no longer speak about UFOs. I mean, that's a given. Anyone who's taken the time and trouble to do research knows that that's a reality. Unidentified flying objects are not unidentified anymore. We know what they are. We simply don't know who's in them and what their agenda is. But we know they're there. So I talk now, and I focus primarily on trying to come to terms with them. Try to see us as they might see us. How do we see ourselves? How do we see them? Are we afraid of them? Are they afraid of us? I think we need to look at it that way. How would they consider us, for example?
Well, I think that's, one of the themes of Project Mindshift. I put forward the historical view to demonstrate that there are credible people and that there's, a considerable amount of solid information so that you can see that there's a reality here. But the questions of who are we and how did we get here and what is life about are extremely important. But also for me, the question is, what's wrong with us? What ails mankind? I think that must be one of the things that if non-human intelligences are observing us in our life here, or they are intimately involved in our life and perhaps have been for tens of thousands of years, what is wrong with us? Why are we so divisive? Why are we so warlike? Why do we have dreams of paradise and dreams of God and brotherhood and sisterhood, but we can't live it? And in the book, I did, in the beginning and the end, try to focus on what non-human intelligences would see if they looked at us, and what we would see if we really looked at ourselves as how we truly are, and not as how we would like to
there's an old
present
adage
ourselves.
about if you could only see yourself as others see you.
Yeah.
Try to see ourselves as they might consider us. That's a good way to
Yeah,
approach it.
and you look at our behavior. One of the things that struck me is it's increasingly on people's minds is that the ecological holocaust that we are now creating. I think there have been 5 previous great mass extinctions in the history of planet Earth, and we're well into the 6th great extinction now, and we are the cause.
Yeah.
It's not a meteor eliminating the dinosaurs. There was just a story in the paper this morning. It was a tiny little story that the first of, I think there are 602 primate species, they said, or 608, and I think a West African primate species has been declared extinct. And the article went on to say that they expect 10% more within the next 20 years, and a further 10% are in danger of extinction.
No, that's terrible.
Now, if you were to come here from elsewhere, you couldn't miss that. Another thing that I discuss in the book is how we treat our own offspring, how we treat our own children. We have a very sentimental, nice view of ourselves, family values, and all of that. But yet, when you look at how we really treat our offspring, it's devastating. And so many of our problems on Earth come from the damage that we do to our own newborn infants. When an infant's born, an infant brings a bit of the cosmos organized as an intelligent, living energy system
It's a little
onto
star
our
seed.
planet. Exactly.
Yeah.
But how we treat it is very disheartening, and it lays the foundation for many of the destructive and self-destructive behaviors that we see, in humanity.
I've tried over the years to try to look at the world as they might see us, and I look at Rwanda, the genocide. I look at Yugoslavia and some of the heartbreak over there. And I really begin to think, do we deserve to make it as a species? Are we orchestrating our own demise? We talk about extinctions. Maybe we're going to orchestrate our own extinction. It's a possibility that rather makes my blood run cold.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a serious possibility. One of the, I also, other than the book, I write a column for UFOcity.com on the web, and I've interviewed a couple of experiencers, and it's Amber and Matthew are their pseudonyms. They don't wish to be known, and their experiences with the extraterrestrials are different, and they give a more hopeful kind of look at the whole situation. Yeah. They didn't have the type of experience that the media tends to emphasize, the traumatic kind of experience, but they didn't have a Pollyanna, transformational, sublime experience either. It seemed to be a very real, grounded thing, but there seemed to be in what they described an effort an effort to help reconnect human beings with the life energy within them, so that therefore human beings could connect once again with the primordial life energy of the universe. And what Matthew said was one communication he got from non-human intelligences was that the only major difference between the human animal and the living, the other living beings who are part of nature, is that they haven't lost this direct connection with the life force, the source, the vital force, whatever you want to call it, the primordial energy of the universe, and we have, and that disconnection is at the core of all of the problems we're having here on Earth.
It's a beautiful, beautiful approach, and I think there's a lot of validity there. We were talking about the mind shift hypothesis, and we were discussing the possibility that there is indeed some kind of a process or a program underway, and the evidence seems to indicate that. Who do you think might be behind this? Who's orchestrating this?
Well, I think that it's multi-level. So on one level, I think that there is a group along the lines of what Stanton Friedman and others called MJ-12. And when I interviewed Dr. Edgar Mitchell for the book, I asked him, did he think there was such a group? And he said, not only was there such a group, there still is such a group. And he considers them to be a grave threat to our constitutional form of government. So I think that if, in the book I put forward a what-if scenario, and so what, if the government knows that these UFOs are real and that there are non-human intelligences behind them, well, what would they do? They wouldn't not do anything. So, and if you go back and look at it historically, I think it was pretty obvious they had to keep things secret at the time.
They had to keep control.
They had to keep control, and I'm sure they acted out of fear of public panic, but also they acted, I think, out of their own fear because they didn't have any knowledge.
Most of them in the original, back in the old days, were military, and they had just come through World War II, and we were right in the middle of the Cold War, and their whole approach was kind of paranoid.
Paranoid, and also they were, the UFOs were flying over the most top secret military
and we had no
installations.
control at all over
Absolutely,
and we don't have any today.
None at all. So I think that there is a lot of evidence and a lot to indicate that such an organization is going on. I think Charles Selye referred to them as PI-40.
Yeah, that's the latest term.
And Dr. Mitchell says there is such a group. But I don't see it as some large, vast conspiracy. What I imagine happening is more along the lines of someone with inside knowledge, say of a crash disk or ET technology, say through the kind of reverse engineering program that Colonel Corso mentioned, perhaps meeting a screenwriter at a Hollywood pool party or a Washington, D.C. cocktail party and, taking someone aside and saying, I have this great idea for a script.
Great script, yes. Would you like to look at it?
And in there, information is kind of seeded. And in the book, I go through different movies where I think there's sort of an indication that perhaps may have
Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Close Encounters is one they talked about. But my favorite one is one of the great movies. Robert Wise was the director, and it's called The Day the Earth Stood Still.
The all-time great movie.
And when you look at that film, particularly if you compare it to other movies of the day, it's inexplicable why that film is so advanced. In the other films, people had levers and pulleys, and it looks like gym lockers up in the spaceships, and they'd send the rocket up, and they'd reverse the footage, and the rocket would come back down. But in Day the Earth Stood Still, from the very beginning, when the spaceship does what all the debunkers want it to do, it lands in Washington, almost on the White House lawn, there's a plasma field pulsating around the disk. That wasn't known 50 years ago. There weren't reports of plasma fields around extraterrestrial craft.
Robert Wise was way ahead of his time.
He really was. And then in the film, Michael Rennie plays Klaatu, the extraterrestrial. When he's in the spacecraft, there are no buttons and there are no computers. Everything is his energy field. Everything is moved. His energy field is in contact with the energy field that's somehow pervading the spaceship. So where did that come from? Later, information came out, through different UFO researchers, suggesting that there were hints of this type of technology. But how did it all find its way into a 50-year-old motion picture when none of the other movies were like that? And similarly with the television, none of the early television shows on this subject were like that. And then later on you hear stories that Spielberg had some coaching for both Close Encounters and E.T.
There are even rumors that the government provided money for Spielberg for Close Encounters.
Right, and then on the negative side, Charles Sellier tells the story of how the government Department of Defense prevented him from making his film Hangar 18, I think is the title, as a documentary.
Yeah.
And he was told he would only be allowed to do it as
Fictional.
fiction. So what I see going on is more along the lines of Colonel Corso's quote of I think General Twining, that this re-education of the American public will be the greatest single enterprise of its kind that anyone's had to be involved in, and that the core of it, he captured in a sentence, the disclosure will be the cover-up, and the cover-up will be the disclosure. So I see it as a as a smaller type thing, and I know many people, it's easy to castigate someone as a conspiracy theorist, but we know, for example, just a couple of months ago, the government, it was revealed that the U.S. government was using the TV networks to get its anti-drug message into the plots of dramas and sitcoms. And so you just take that principle that the government will use the media to get its message across, and you apply it to this very serious phenomenon of extraterrestrial life and visitations from other worlds. And why wouldn't they use the mass media for that purpose?
Many, many years ago, I concluded that there is a group, whether you call them MJ-12 or it doesn't matter, they do exist. And it became very apparent to many of us who were researching it that it wasn't just a national thing. There were appearances that it was an international thing, that there were representatives from the United Kingdom, probably England, France, Germany, Italy, that it was an international process and a multi-agency process. It wasn't just our security people. So no question in my mind that it is going on. Now, I don't know whether it's being orchestrated from this group by itself or not.
Well, I think this group is just part of it, and they're doing kind of what they do.
You're familiar with the Brookings report.
Yes.
And they made it pretty clear back in '61 that this reality, if and when it should come out, is going to have an impact on the world, and it'll particularly impact the theological and the scientific communities. And I think that whoever, MJ-12 or whatever, whoever's orchestrating this thing, is following that Brookings finding almost to the letter.
Well, even also the CIA Robertson panel made a recommendation that there be an education campaign, toward the public. And that's in the documents that have been released.
I was in a conversation with Robert Bigelow some years back in Las Vegas, and I think you know who Bob is.
Yes, I do.
He's a researcher. He's a sincere man. He's got more money than God, but anyhow, he's put a lot of his energy and money into
God
this.
gives his money to the poor.
Yes, that's true, yeah. And Bob and I were having lunch, and we were discussing this thing, and I'm banging on the table about the lying and the cover-up and the underhanded cheating that was going on and this and that, and then God, blah, 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 their agenda is such and such. And Bigelow says, calm down, calm down. He says, everyone has an agenda. Everyone. But he says, there's only one agenda. And I says, oh, and he points up. And I says, and you mean? And he says, yeah, it's their agenda. And he says, I've been convinced for years that how it's released, how much is released, they're monitoring that. And they sometimes know us better than we know ourselves. So I've almost reached that conclusion that the true disclosure, the agenda, the mind shift thing, is in their hands.
Well, you know, when I said earlier that there was a multi-level
Yeah.
phenomenon, and so probably
A hierarchy sort of
probably
thing.
the smallest players are the people who think they're the most important, which would be the people with the secrets. But and then of course there's the level of that you just mentioned. What active role do these non-human intelligences themselves play? In the middle, I think there's another factor that's not looked into that much, and that's that there's a biological revolution going on in the human animal on planet Earth, and it's been going on at least for 100 years now, and that these changes, these basic changes in human beings, are occurring over decades, and probably will occur over centuries. But what we see is a gradual opening, opening of people, a gradual increasing of their capacity to tolerate these new kinds of knowledge. Some people would call it a new consciousness, or an increased consciousness of who we are and what our place in the universe is, and being able to be open about questions about our origin. And so this biological revolution is I think, a major part of the mind shift that's going on. I remember when I was a kid, we wondered, you know, could people ever send a rocket to the moon? And that was, you know, the really big thing. And of course we did. A friend of mine teaches kindergarten children, and he heard that I had done this book, and he did an informal survey of his kids, and he found out that 100% of the little children not only believed that there were intelligent beings elsewhere, they expected to meet one in their own lifetime. So that's the kind of mind shift that's part of this biological revolution of mankind that's underway, which is, of course, much broader and deeper than the activities of any kind of clandestine group.
It isn't just biological, is it? It's sociological, psychological, theological. Every aspect of the human species is changing.
Exactly, and I use the term biological to indicate that the human animal, as an expression of nature, as an expression of the life force of nature, is in its entirety changing. And then, of course, you see the expression of that change in sociology and in religion and in government and in family life.
Well, I think there's an old saying going back God knows when. And someone my age, I'm filled with old sayings, but something about the effect that you either grow or you die. And I think that's very true and applicable to any species. You evolve, you grow, you adapt, or you become extinct. And the human is, I think, going through that crucial transformation now, as you point out, that it's not just transit, it literally is a transcendent transformation of not only the species, but everything. It's a spiritual matter. We're becoming aware for the first time. Well, at least modern science is becoming aware. Our philosophers in centuries past knew these things, but we're becoming aware that there's more to this reality we see than just the basic scientific fundamentals, that there is something like spirit involved, there is intelligence involved, there's consciousness involved. And it's not just here on planet Earth, it's the entire cosmos that's conscious, that's aware, that's intelligent. And we're growing as a part of that. And that to me is probably the most exciting thing about all of this. And I'd love to hang around another 100 years.
I would love to.
I don't know that I'll be able to pull that off, but...
well, maybe you'll come back.
Well, I know I come back. You know, we've discussed this before, that I'm totally convinced in the reality of reincarnation. The soul, the spirit, whatever you wish to call it, is immortal. And that is an essential ingredient to this process that's underway at the moment.
And I think, you know, from my investigation of this phenomenon, it seems that we can't skip this step. You know, that what's going on now, this evolutionary change in us, is taking place here on Earth, in this physical realm, in this form, in these bodies that we have. And we can't leap ahead. You know, we can't go from A to Z. We have
You have to go to B, C,
right.
D, and E,
and
so forth.
and it's a painful transition. And what's always struck me about the UFO phenomenon is, many times it starts with looking at a light in the sky, and then you wonder, where does that light, and the question, where does that light in the sky come from? And that's a broader question. And then, gee, it seems to be intelligent, and that's a broader question. Well, who's the intelligent? Where do they come from? And the questions get broader and deeper, but then they come back to those same questions at the beginning. Who are we? And what kind of universe are we living in? And how do we fit in to this?
See,
and what's our role?
When I first began really getting into this thing many years ago, I was curious, and like everybody else, I wanted to know who they were, where they from, why they're here. And over the years, I find that my whole process, my whole concept changed. I'm still interested in that. I know they're here, and I know they've been here from God knows how long, the beginning of our time. I'm interested in what their agenda is and where they're going. But the most important thing out of all of it, that I've concluded over the years, is us. Who are we? And I think that's the whole point of this whole thing. What is the human species? How did we get here? Is there a purpose? Is there a meaning in our lives? Are we just a cosmic accident? Some little piece of slime that decided to become intelligent or something? The human species is, I think, the source or the basic point in the entire program. It's us. And what they're doing here involves us. Mm-hmm. And I think we're being upgraded. I think not only we're being upgraded biologically, and I think that's what the abduction scenario is basically about. I've reached a conclusion many years ago that we are being genetically improved continually. It's not just something that happened when old Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon made the shift. Mm-hmm. I think it's happening now. And at lunch we were discussing these incredible twins you were describing.
Oh yes,
which strike me as classic examples of the new race, the new species. Mm-hmm. I think Ed Mitchell would call them Homo noeticus.
Right, I like that term better. I think it's David Jacobs who feels that there's some hybrid, extraterrestrial human hybrid, and he calls them Homo alienus.
Alienus? Well, I like David, and I respect him. He's a brilliant man. He, as you know, teaches history at, is it Temple?
Yeah, I think so.
But he's taken the approach recently with his book, The Threat, that we're in for some bad times here, and that there's no good involved here. And I discussed this with him briefly over at San Jose last month. In your book, in your interview with Jacobs, and it's a part that I wanted to refer to here, if Dr. Jacobs is correct, the alien abduction breeding hybrid integration program will transform all aspects of human society: religion, science, government, education, family life, sexual life, and our view of who we are and what our place is in the universe. Can a program that is carried out in secrecy and that causes such trauma lead to transcendence? The jury is still out, and it is we who are on trial, awaiting the verdict. Mm-hmm. Well, that paragraph is dynamite, and I find that I do agree. All of that is happening, and yes, we can make that transcendent transition. I feel hopeful about it.
I do too, and I mentioned earlier I interviewed an experiencer who I gave the name Amber to, and what was fascinating about her experience was that she seemed to have a kind of energy medicine treatment when she was on board the spaceship or whatever the environment is, that she was in. And she didn't know that she had this experience until 10 years afterwards. And what happened to her was she seemed in her work with the UFO researcher who put her in an altered state and relaxed state, and she had this memory. It seemed that in this session she had a whole years and years worth of work of energy medicine in this one encounter with the extraterrestrials or the non-human
Talk about a
intelligences.
transformational experience.
And what happened was her life took a 180-degree turn. She was kind of a determined businesswoman, ran her own business, put in 14, 15-hour days, had no awareness of UFOs, extraterrestrial phenomena, noetic science, anything like that. You know, her work was her life. She didn't know that she had this experience, and suddenly, the only thing she knew is she woke up one morning and she had strange symbols that were impressed into the skin above her knees. And she had no idea where they came from, and she wrote them down on a piece of paper, got a little manila folder, called it hieroglyphics. You know, she checked her bed to see if she'd slept on something that made the impression. There was nothing there. And it wasn't for a decade that she investigated the origin of those symbols and found that she'd had this experience with non-human intelligences. And it was at that time when she had this energy treatment that led to the literal transformation of her life. And recently she just graduated from a healing school.
Amazing.
And she was completely unaware of it, and yet her life was totally transformed.
Did she ever track the symbols to any source?
She's never been able to find out, you know, what they...
Not Egyptian, maybe? Or
no, it wasn't Egyptian, and it wasn't, you know, I can't remember what she checked, but there have been many, because she spent many years studying ancient symbols and Western mystery tradition and all kinds of things, and has shown it around to different UFO researchers, but no one's been able to... The closest that came was about 6 months ago. There was an article in the Times about a form of Chinese language that's disappearing. There's only a handful of people left who speak it. It was wiped out by the Red Guard, and there was one symbol that was kind of similar to that symbol. But how many such people are there who have had experiences, who have no idea that they had an experience, and yet whose lives have been transformed in this positive way, which is very different than the scenario of human-alien hybrids and introducing them into society. I mean, I think Dr. Jacobs' scenario sounds more like us.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds more to me like a totalitarian Nazi regime.
Yeah, we're imagining them through our own thinking.
Right.
Which is, I guess, all we can do.
It's all we can do, but I think it's important for us not to do that.
Yeah.
It's important for us not to project.
Step aside and try to think and look at this in a different
Because
view.
that will prevent us from seeing what's really there. If we project from our own fears or lack of knowledge, or even from our own hopes, if we project those onto the unknown, that is a tremendous obstacle in the way to ever knowing.
We were talking at dinner last night about a subject that I found kind of amusing, and yet it's very serious. And that is the theological implications of this. One of the things that the Brookings report covered was this aspect of this. How will the major religions on the planet deal with this reality? And I dealt with that when I was studying the NATO report in 1964, the assessment. And one of the annexes on that was the theological implications. Well, I had some first-hand experience with that myself over the years, where I've been making presentations, and I'm pretty outspoken. I'm pretty blunt. I guess it's my old infantry field training. You know, I'm not terribly subtle sometimes, and I'm holding forth. I believe it was in Houston, which is part of the Bible Belt, about my views about the theological implications and the fact that probably, in my view, every major religion on the planet has had its source and its origin in connection with the extraterrestrial intelligence. And that's a little delicate to get involved with sometimes. So I'm in front of about 600 and 700 people there in Houston. And I said, what would you do? How could you handle it if you were to find that beautiful young man from Galilee 2,000 years ago was involved in this program? Could you deal with that? And there was a kind of a murmur in the audience, and they're all looking at each other. And I went on and I said, you know, there are evidence, there's indications that he very well may have been a part of this thing because of some of the things he himself said. You know, where he says, I'm not from this world, this is not my kingdom. In my Father's house are many mansions, and so on and so on and so on. Well, at the end of the thing, I was a little bit uncertain. I thought I might be mobbed and beaten half to death by a bunch of fundamental Baptists. Yeah, Pat Robertson types who said, you know, stone them with rocks. You know, he said that on TV one
I know.
Anyhow, I'm a little dubious. And at the end of my presentation, I'm mobbed. Here they come. Oh, boy. There's a tide of people coming to the stage. And I'm standing back a little bit. And there was one little short, heavy-set chap in the lead with a Bible under his arm. And I thought, oh, boy, I'm in for it. Well, this minister, this fundamentalist Baptist minister, carrying his Bible, came up on the stage and went right at me, threw his arms around me, hugged me and kissed me, and said, Brother Bob, you told it the way it should be told. And I was absolutely shocked. And, you know, that was most encouraging to me. So now I've even stepped out more and more over the last few years.
Oh,
have you had any experiences of your own like that?
On the radio, but I haven't had the positive experience. I've had people feel I was, you know, consorting with Satan and
the devils, the
devils. And I remember I was on the radio in, I think, Tulsa, and someone said I deserved to die with the people at Heaven's Gate. Other people have said they would pray for me for the rest of my life, which I could use.
We can all use a little of that.
Hopefully do that. But one experience was very telling. I think I don't remember what part of the country, but it was a fundamentalist part of the country. And a young woman called up, and she was very frightened, and she told on the radio, it was the first time she told anyone that she had these experiences, and she was having them, you know, in proximity to the phone call. And she didn't know where to turn to, because she feared turning, you know, to her church or her pastor, because she feared she would be seen as being somehow involved with Satan. And I was able, you know, off air to give her a phone number to call where she could find someone in the area that she could talk to, so she could learn that she wasn't alone and that there was a whole other level and nature to these kinds of experiences. But it made me realize how many people there are who are alone and have nobody to turn to, and the suffering that they go through, because our society in general, we accept aliens and TV commercials and movies and cartoons and things like that, but we don't accept them if...
We don't want to take them seriously.
Right, and we definitely don't accept them if, in general, if a family member, a friend, or a coworker says that they're having these kinds of experiences, they're, you know, shunned. But on the other hand, the Catholic Church is an interesting exception to this. They have an ongoing study group called the colloquial name is Starship Vatican. I don't know.
Is that the one Balducci is involved
I think so. And
Monsignor Corrado Balducci.
Right. Yes. He's been on the television in Italy 5 times this summer.
And he's been rather blunt with some of his statements.
Very blunt. Very blunt. And the basic theme is that life beyond Earth is not in conflict with Catholic theology. So you get this balance, you know, you get this these two sides. From Pat Robertson stoned them to death, and the Catholic Church is interesting because of its historical role in the suppression.
Yeah. Remember how they burned
Giordano Bruno.
Poor Bruno went to the stake. Yeah.
Bruno is
Galileo escaped by the...
Well, he learned the lesson of Bruno.
Exactly.
And Bruno is, you know, Bruno is one of my heroes, and it's one of Bruno's work is a body of work that opened me when I was young to the reality of the extraterrestrial phenomenon.
That's great.
Because, you know, I would ask myself, how did this man know, before the invention of the telescope, how did he know that the stars were suns and that they had planets, just as our sun has planets, and the planets had life, and they had intelligent life?
Exactly.
And he didn't, many people wrote about this, a sentence here, a paragraph there, but Bruno traveled throughout Europe teaching, teaching this, and he died February 1600, burned at the stake. No students, no legacy, everyone was afraid to mention him, and yet 30 years after his death, it was Bruno's view that was the accepted view.
Yeah.
Well, Bruno went far beyond Copernicus and even Galileo. So that I feel at times that that could happen, even in these dark days, with with the extraterrestrial UFO phenomenon. That it could be 2030, and things that we're discussing hesitantly or without great certainty may be common knowledge by the year 2030.
You know, Michael, the establishment has ways of burning people at the stake even today. It's not as obvious as that. I mean, it's not as crude as that. But they can take a scholar, a professional, and literally ruin his reputation and his standing in his community. Look what they tried to do to John Mack here just a couple, 3 years ago.
Well, exactly. I know Dr. Mack, and a number of years ago when I was working with the Friends of the Institute of Noetic Sciences.
You're a member of that.
I'm a member for many years, and I was, for a couple of years, I was on the board of directors of the New York affiliate.
I take great pride in being an IONS member.
Well, I do too, and I'm proud to be associated with Dr. Mitchell's group. And we were putting on a 100th anniversary workshop on Wilhelm Reich and his work. And
look what they did to him.
Exactly. And that was why I asked Dr. John Mack would he consider coming as a speaker, because in his story showed that we've made some progress, because he didn't lose his job and he didn't wind up in prison and they didn't burn his books as they did with Reich, but his reputation was sullied and he nearly lost everything, and he suffered tremendously professionally and personally. So it shows how far we still have to go, with this phenomenon, and it's the implications of it, as you said earlier. The thing that frightens people are the implications that the life will change individually, not in some detached outer way.
At the lowest level, all the way up, everything will change.
It will change at the core. And can we change? Can we live in this new world? Is there a place for us? And I think these fears are unconscious. People aren't aware of them generally, and they don't articulate them.
They're felt at a very deep level. An animalistic, almost survival thing. People feel threatened, and it hits them spiritually and physically, because they know in a sense that their world is changing. The old world is literally going to come to an end. It won't explode, but the old world will come to an end. And this transition into this new paradigm is going to be so damn thorough and so incredibly shaking that there will be people, Michael, who may not be able to handle that. There will be people who cannot make that transition.
And I think that brings us back to the beginning of our talk with why I feel there was some validity for keeping things secret 50 years ago.
To some degree.
To some degree.
Yeah.
That I know there were a lot of negative reasons why people did things and negative consequences to the continued secrecy. But I think we can't ignore that there was a reality to the idea that there would be, I think at that time, larger numbers of people for whom this would be devastating.
Yeah. I think the MJ-12 people, whoever they were, and if they really did exist, probably were expressing their own fears and uncertainties when they established the policies to keep the lid on this damn thing, and then let's let it simmer for 50 more years and see what happens.
It's a very exciting thing. I don't know if you're aware of Reich's book, Contact with Space.
No.
It was published posthumously after his death in prison. And a lot of it describes work that he did in just outside Tucson in Oracle. And I was down there just a couple of days ago. And so his work was on my mind. And something you just said triggered it. He was working with a device he called a cloud buster.
The Argon.
Yeah, the Argon energy. And he was looking at unusual objects in the sky And Air Force planes were flying around monitoring his operations while he was doing this. And they're out in the desert, and I don't think they were jets, and you could see the insignia on the plane with binoculars. And he withdrew atmospheric energy from the area where these lights were. He had an intuition that they weren't stars, that they were space machines. And when he withdrew energy from that area, the light wobbled and blinked on and off and withdrew.
Because he was taking energy.
He was taking the energy. He felt that they were using this energy that we've long postulated exists. You know, we go back to ancient Taoism, and they had a belief that there was a primordial cosmic energy, and it was an atmospheric energy, and it was our life energy. And Reich was working with this as a 20th century scientist. So he withdrew the energy, and there was a reaction from this object, whatever it was. And he said, at that moment, he saw the whole world of 20th century thought and civilization and culture tumbling away. And now anything was possible.
Exactly. Wonderful. It's a shame what happened to Reich.
Yeah, and yet I think, you know, when you asked me how I got involved in this, I was, you know, studying energy, and I was and still am very interested in his work. And when I paid my first visit to the Reich Museum up in Maine, I was aware of his work as a student of Freud, and I was aware of his book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, and his breakthrough into what we now call mind-body medicine or energy medicine. But when I got to the museum, I saw a book, a magazine called Cosmic Orgone Engineering, and this edition was devoted to an article, Spaceships, Drought, and Deadly Orgone Energy. And my whole mind expanded, and I didn't know the details, and I didn't know what was involved in it, but I thought, oh my God, this energy pursuit involves everything. And
you went through a mind shift.
I went through my own mind shift in August 1970, and this article is amazing. I mean, Reich he reported his own observations, and he reported on his own energy work and how it related to the reports of UFOs that were coming out in the early 50s. And many of the things he reported were later reported and written down on paper by individual citizens, military people, government people, pilots. And it's a crucial part of my understanding of the mind shift that's going on here on Earth.
We certainly did a job on Reich. We simply burned him at the stake, a modern stake, and that's tragic. You know, you're part of the mind shift yourself. This book, whether you know it or not, and I'm assuming you do know, is part of the mind shift. Now, you don't work for the government. You're not a part of MJ-12, I'm assuming, or any of that. But this piece of work, and I say this to the viewer again, this is dynamite. And that's part of the mind shift. And I like, to some level, at some degree, I guess it's just a human thing, but I would like to feel that maybe I too, in some tiny way, is a part of this mind shift.
Well, I think we all are, because if this book is, I was influenced, you know, by your work. I have on the video, The Greatest Story Never Told, and I've seen your reference in other works, and I was just so impressed that you would speak out, you know, and that you would come forward and not stand back in the shadows.
I'm an ornery old cuss, you know.
And so, in a way, we all have a piece of, if it's a puzzle, we all have a piece of the puzzle. And, you know, your work influenced me, and the other people I interviewed in the book, I chose them because their work.
Well, that's gratifying. Thank you for saying that.
And that's why I was honored to be asked to come and be here and meet you and
you were
have this discussion.
Definitely on the list. There was no way to leave you off, you know. As I said, this is an important book, Michael, and I hope it goes on and become even more successful. I don't know whether we've got a movie script here or not, but it would make one hell of a film.
It would make a good film, and you know, I'm actually, you know, working on, not specifically that, but I have written a treatment for a script. And
I have friends in Hollywood, you know. Yeah, I just 2 days ago attended a film preview in Sedona, of one of Paul David's newest films. I mean, Paul was the one who wrote, produced, directed Roswell.
Ah, yes, I saw that.
And he's got a new film out called Starry Night, which is charming, poetic, sensitive, touching, delightful. You'll see it eventually, yeah. But I'm trying to get back to where I was trying to say something here. Recently in San Jose, I was speaking out at a Bay Area UFO conference. And I had an opportunity to show some NASA Apollo photographs to the audience. Now these are pictures, photos taken by Apollo 11, 12, and 13, 14, so on or near the moon. And at the bottom of the photographs are the shot number, whether it's Apollo 11, 12, 13, or so on, the roll number, and the negative numbers. Now these are legitimate Apollo NASA photographs, and hardly anyone has ever seen these before. And I showed them to this audience of about 1,200 people there, and my God, they gasped in the audience. They couldn't believe it. One of the objects that the Apollo 13 guys had photographed was an artificial metallic structure 5 miles long.
Wow.
And it's there in the film, and you can see it. And on the same program was a scientist, a retired NASA scientist, with the name of Norman Berggren, who has written a book called The Ringmakers of Saturn. And he had photographs taken by some of our early, I think, surveyors that were out there near Saturn and so on. And they photographed objects that literally, not only hundreds, thousands of miles long, artificially constructed metallic objects. Now, if that doesn't become a major portion of the mind shift, where people look up there and see that and say, is that real? And Berggren says, this is an actual photograph, we've studied it. I am a retired NASA man, I have some credibility. It's real. There's an artificial object in the rings of Saturn that's about the size of our moon. Self-luminous, circular, gigantic, that moves around. Doesn't stay in one place. Now, this indicates, as Michio Kaku says, that there are very likely type 1, 2, and 3, and 4 civilizations out there. And we're seeing the evidence of them. And that awareness, that reality, as shocking as it is going to bring about a mind shift. And so I'm hopeful that we're going to make it, Michael.
Well, I'm hopeful. I was up in New England, and in 1999, in July, it was July 20th, and the reason I know the date, it was the 30th anniversary of our landing on the moon. And I went to an evening introductory astronomy program where they were teaching people to recognize the constellations and major stars, the North Star and all of that.
Where was this, in England?
No, in New England.
New England?
In Maine. And anyway, there was an astronomer there, and there was a large telescope, and it was pointed at Tranquility Base. And I was standing with a man, two people I didn't really know. One was a man, probably about 80, and he had a powerful pair of binoculars, and a younger man, I think he was a psychologist. And I looked in the southwest, and I thought I saw a satellite. And so I pointed out this satellite, and the older man looked with his binoculars, and he said, that ain't no satellite. And we watched it. You know, a satellite just takes its regular trajectory across the sky.
Doesn't deviate at all.
Doesn't deviate. And what happened was, it came from the southwest, and the astronomer giving the class had just showed us where the North Star was. And so it came across the sky, and it stopped, and then it headed due north. And we called out to the other people. There were about 15 other people who were watching, being shown these constellations, which don't really exist. And nobody would look. Absolutely no one would look. And then, so we watched this light. It just stopped, and it looked just like a star. And that was in the northern portion of the sky. That was astounding. But then a star that was to the left of the object we just watched position itself there, moved over toward it. And then I just had a feeling they were communicating. And then the star that had been to the left remained where it was. and the one we watched cross the sky went down below the trees that were in the distance.
That's amazing, really is. You know, there's a story told by Alan Hynek before he died. He and Jacques Vallée were attending a conference, I believe, in somewhere in British Columbia. And this was an astronomy conference, packed with astronomers, astrophysicists, people from all over. And Jacques, as you probably remember, was an astronomer, astrophysicist, as well as a computer genius. And he and Alan were there together, attending, just not as speakers, but as observers. Someone rushed in and said, whether you like it or not, guys, hey, there's a UFO up there, and I'm serious. Hynek said not one member of that august, esteemed group went outside to look. Now, these are astronomers and astrophysicists. And I get a chance to ask Hynek before he died, didn't you go out and look? You know, he said, no, they didn't even bother. They didn't want to see it.
Right. And that's, you know, that's right there is the essence of the mind shift that has to take place. And I mean, I witnessed it up there, you know, in the country, and it was an astounding thing. But another thing that's part of the mind shift also is in myself, I felt something pushing in me to deny what I had just seen.
Really?
There was a part of me that was saying, you couldn't have really seen that. That couldn't have really happened. So I have a kind of compassion for people, say the people who wouldn't, or because it was that they couldn't look. You know, they don't have the capacity to look, and I could feel it, that I could, as a empathetic human.
I got into a discussion, rather heated discussion one time with an astronomer down in Tucson. And we were not on tape or in front of an audience or anything at the kind. We were in a group of people. And we were talking about the thing. And I says, when are you going to just damn fess up and own up to the reality that there's something going on here? And you're going to have to address it whether you like it or not. And he says, no, it's not true. I don't want it to be true. And then he stopped for a moment and he realized what he had said. And everybody looked at him and said, you don't want it to be true? What's that got to do with whether it is or not? You see?
Right.
Well, I think there's a lot of that in many people. It can't be true because I don't want it to be true. I'm not yet ready to deal with that.
Exactly. And the more powerful the phenomenon, the more powerful that reaction is. But I do feel if we have hope, it's really in the children. About a year ago, I live in Manhattan, and I was walking home one Saturday afternoon. There was a father, and he had his young daughter over his shoulder. So I guess she was tired at the end of the day, and we caught up to each other at a streetlight, and the little girl was singing. I'm not going to try to sing this, but to the tune of the caissons go rolling along, she was singing, and the Air Force has stopped, and the spaceships are flying back home. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and so I could have gone this way, but I went this way, and she just kept singing this.
I'd like to know where she got that.
Where did she get that?
Yeah.
You know, so there's this things that were tremendous intellectual leaps for earlier generations.
Well, for the little ones, it's not that big a leap.
No, it isn't at all. They're born, and that's the world that they know, and they have another leap, and maybe their part of the mind shift is conscious contact.
I determined some time back that I've given up really trying to crusade and teach or convince anybody who isn't interested or doesn't want to be convinced of this. And I concluded some years ago that it's the young people. There's where the hope is for the future. And so I've been writing a curriculum for some years. I've been trying to put it together for elementary and secondary kids on this subject. And so in Tucson, before I moved up here to Phoenix, I was fortunate enough to be invited by a number of different teachers that I knew to come into their classroom and run an hour or so of this idea in front of the kids and see how it worked. And I must have spoken 4 or 5 times. A couple of elementaries and a couple of secondary schools, freshman, sophomore high school, you know. I was overwhelmed at the response. These kids went wild with this because I wasn't even halfway into the presentation, and their hands were going up and their eyes were getting bright, and they were getting involved. And not only did they want to know more, they wanted to contribute. And I was so gratified by that. But I'm beginning to worry because let's say I finish my curriculum, get it written, have it ready to go. What are the chances of me getting that by a Board of Education, you know?
Exactly.
Are you going to know the problems in trying to get them to talk about sex education or anything like that? Trying to talk about this in schools.
Yeah. Well, maybe in an after-school program.
Yeah, after-school programs. At the teen center, maybe, whatever.
But you know, we have in New York, the American Museum of Natural History just opened a new planetarium in the spring of 2000, the Rose Planetarium. And they have a true mind shift show there. It's a very sophisticated, computer-generated program. I don't really know how they do it, but it's not like the old planetariums where the astronomer would be in the middle and you'd have the pointer with the red light. It's three-dimensional, and the objects float past you. The planets float by, and you really feel you could touch them like you could touch anything in this room. It is so powerful. It's about 19 minutes long, and I think if everybody could see that show, there would be no doubt that life is ubiquitous throughout the universe, and that this mystery that we're part of is one of the most beautiful things that you could imagine, and perhaps it could help us shed our preoccupation with all of these petty problems that we have here on Earth. We focus on the most petty things, and we're so destructive, and all you have to do is look up at the sky, and you can't help but be awed by the vastness and mystery that we're part of.
Michael, that poetic vision of yours is beautiful, and it's the kind of thing that I would like to have more people see and understand. So I would like to encourage you. I hope that you've got another book in mind.
Well, I have a couple.
Do you?
I have a couple of books.
This description you just came up with about this vision of the future and the hope and the dream and the spirit of it all.
I have one. I don't know if I'll use this as the title, but it's taking the mind shift term and using its cosmic mind shift, and it's about the global nature of the phenomenon, and not just the global nature of the sightings and the reports, but the possibility that this phenomenon could help human beings see that we're Earthlings. You know, just the other day on the radio, someone asked, well, these extraterrestrials, who would they, you know, why don't they come and talk to our leaders? Well, but who would they talk to?
Who would they talk to?
Who would they talk to? We had in New York just a few days ago, there was for the first time, 150 world leaders met at the UN. Well, they couldn't go to any particular one.
Well, I looked at that motley crew. I was in a big photograph of them, and I thought, how many of them there in that group have this vision of tomorrow that you just expressed so eloquently? I wonder how many of them are out there who are world leaders.
Yeah.
Maybe 5 out of the whole bunch, if we're lucky.
Yeah, and they would be hemmed in by the structure in which they operate. But I think it will come, as many of these things do, from the bottom up, from the people up. I mean, I've been a health writer for 25 years now, and I've been interested in energy medicine for over 30 years. But it's the people of the country who have forced the medical industry
the people themselves
to change. The industry didn't want to change, but it was forced to change. So I think by this gradual spreading, what I call a mind shift, that the people will change. That in 15 years, these kids who are in kindergarten will be college graduates, and they'll be moving into roles in astronomy and all kinds of space science.
I have a few years on you. I won't tell you how many.
Okay.
But the point is that I've noticed that, hopefully, over the years that I've been around, that there have been some very positive changes, that there has been an ongoing kind of mind shift for the last 40, 50 years. And I hope it'll continue, and I think it's accelerating.
Yeah, I think particularly in the last 5 years, it seems to be a very rapid acceleration. And that reminds me of your earlier point of the extraterrestrial role. in this mind shift, and it seems that that they do make contact with people who then do have an impact on the public. And I don't know if it's direct, I don't know if it's subliminal. You know, I know that many stories of people who are taught and then, you know, go out and share their teachings with fellow humans.
Well, you know John Mack as well as you know Bud Hopkins. And you've interviewed them both, and I think you've had some private conversations with them because they're in here. And I have always held, and this is a little delicate and a little awkward sometimes for some people, but I've always had this glimmering sense that all of us that feel so strongly about this, and you felt strongly enough to write a beautiful book about this, I've had a nagging feeling you may have had a contact, Michael. Do you ever think about that?
I do think about it.
Do you?
I do, and
nothing that's conscious or that you could remember.
Well, you know,
Or have had strange dreams, perhaps?
well, you know, when you asked me about the what I have for, you know, an idea for books, I'm working on a book called Real Dreams, the interface of imagination and experience, because I do have a lifelong series of dreams that I could call my regular dreams, and then my extraterrestrial related dreams.
And then lucid dreams that are
a lot of them are lucid dreams.
Yeah.
And so for the last 2 years, because of my partner Trish, she encouraged me to write down these dreams. I didn't write them down over the years. Now I wish I'd had. So that's
a lot
something.
of gold in those dreams. Yeah.
A lot of really interesting information in them. And so anyway, I'm working on that. I put all the dreams together, and what I'd like to do is have an introduction, basically showing how all the different cultures have valued dreams. You know, we may interpret them in different ways or place different values on them from antiquity to the present, but we've all recognized that there's value in the dreams, and then there would be the dreams themselves, and then the third part would be my analysis.
Well, I salute Trish for keeping you on that path, and I encourage her to keep you at it.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Even take a tape recorder if you have.
Yeah. Well, you know, I try to write them down in the middle of the night, and I find that it's easy to jot down these kind of notes. But you know, that question of what role do these non-human intelligences play? How do they influence people, and how does it show up socially? You know, and as you said, in your activity, mine, you know, other people, and people we don't know. I mean, a lot of people took the opportunity when they heard I was writing this book, relatives sometimes and strangers, to unburden themselves of experiences that they'd had with extraterrestrials that they'd never shared with anybody.
I've had the same thing happen to me. You speak to them and they think, oh, now I can talk to him.
Yeah.
I can tell somebody what happened. Yeah. Michael, in our earlier conversations, we were discussing between us what we considered to be essentially the most important aspect of this whole thing. Now, I think we both concluded that they're here, whoever they are, and they've been here for a very long time. We've discussed about what are their purposes, what's their agenda, what is the reason that they're here. And over the years, I have come to some conclusions of my own that they have had a hand in the development of the human race from the beginning of its history. And one of the things that excites me the most, I think, is that I have noticed over the last few years the growth and development of a spiritual kind of awareness on the part of a lot of people involving them and where they're from and why they're here and how they relate to us. And I have almost concluded that beyond the hardware, beyond the reality of extraterrestrial intelligence, which I think is a given, there's no question in my mind about it. The evidence is literally overwhelming. What is essentially taking place in the human race? I've concluded that it involves an expansion of consciousness. It involves not merely a physical kind of transition, but it's a spiritual thing. That the real essential point here is not that they're there, we're going to meet them, we're going to be interrelating with them, but it's something taking place within the heart and soul and the spirit of the human being that to me is the most important thing. And I got the nagging feeling that you had reached almost that same conclusion. Would you elaborate on that for me?
Well, sure, I'd be happy to. And I do feel I'm moving in the same direction. I might use different words to express it.
Mm-hmm.
But my feeling is that for most of our recorded history, we humans have developed two main ways of trying to understand reality, understand ourselves and the world in which we live. And although there are thousands of examples of them, you could describe them in two ways. And one would be religion or a spiritual point of view, and the other would be science. And there are many types of religions and spiritual paths and many types of science. But I feel that these tools that we use to investigate reality and learn who we are and where we are and why we're here are inadequate to understand the UFO phenomenon and the extraterrestrial phenomenon. I think that the mechanistic scientists who try to understand the UFO phenomenon are limited by the mechanistic nature of their thought. There are aspects to the phenomenon that their tools can't apprehend.
Those are the only tools they seem to have.
Right, and they're the tools that they're comfortable with and that they know how to use. But more so, they're the tools that were created by their character structure. So they're not independently existing tools. So it's the character structure of the scientists that is creating these very tools. So the tools are inadequate, but the person's own character structure blocks them from direct contact with this energy phenomenon that we call UFOs. And then similarly, people coming from a metaphysical point of view understand the phenomenon in a different way than the mechanistic scientists, but their tool of thought and their character structure keeps them from comprehending the fullness of it, just as the mechanistic scientists can't, because our character structure of the average human being today, the way we think, is a combination of mechanism and mysticism. And so you find that most scientists, Western scientists who look into cosmic things, eventually become mystics because they've reached the dead end of their mechanistic way of thinking.
Einstein himself was going in that direction.
Exactly, but the mystical part, the mystical approach, the purely subjective approach, also is inadequate to comprehending this phenomenon that we call UFOs, and I see it as this energy phenomenon. So my energy studies over the past 30 years have led me to the conclusion that this transformation, this transformation of our character structure and our consciousness has to do with coming into direct contact with this life energy that we've postulated exists, our whole human existence. We've called it God in various religions all over Earth, and we've called it ether or prana or elan vital, and we've given it various names in science and natural philosophy.
The Hindus call it Brahma.
Exactly.
The everything.
Yes. So I think that this transformation that's going on, of which the UFO ET phenomena seems to be playing a central role, is to help human beings feel this bioenergy, which is a function of this primordial cosmic energy.
It's essentially what we are.
It's what we are. We are energy. Matter is frozen energy. But we don't feel it. We have what Wilhelm Reich called armoring, that we don't just have rigid ways of thinking, that we have rigid musculature. And the rigid thinking and the rigid musculature are functionally identical. And it's these rigidities that block the movement of energy in our bodies. And because that energy is blocked and not freely flowing, it's not in contact with the energy of our environment. And it can't make contact with the energy of the phenomena that we call UFOs or extraterrestrial. So the change that I see happening is a gradual softening of these rigidities and a gradual opening up to being able to feel this life energy moving in us, and therefore a greater opportunity to make contact with life energy outside of us. And I think when that happens, we'll be able to look back and we will have developed a new way of being. And out of that new way of being, we'll develop new tools for understanding. And when we do that and we look back at our era, we'll see that mechanism had certain things that were valuable, and metaphysics and spirituality had certain things that were valuable. But like parents, they gave birth to a child that's not the father or the mother, but has elements of both, but it's a new functioning, living thing into and of itself.
Almost a new species unto itself.
Right, and that for me, the great challenge and opportunity of the UFO ET phenomena is this transformation. And the essence of the change in consciousness is the direct contact of the human animal with life energy within him or herself, and then in the atmosphere and the planet, connection with other living life forms on Earth, and connection with beings from elsewhere in a universe itself that is this living energy.
Some of our ancient ancestors understood that much better than we do.
Oh, they did. When you go back to, I sometimes feel that what we have is the superstructure of the ancient thoughts, and we've lost the core or the heart of it. But you see it in the ancient Hindu writings,
Yeah.
and you see it in some of the early Egyptian and other writings.
Well, the Bhagavad Gita touches upon it thoroughly in the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
And
It's an amazing piece of
There's a new translation. I was reading this in last December, I think. The word, I don't know how they pronounced it in Egyptian, but we would spell it K-I. It had always been translated as soul, and the new translation is life energy.
Probably much more realistic.
And so I think this movement toward life energy will resolve the contradictions that exist now in these two great thought systems of science and religion, and that there will be this new synthesis. If the thesis was spirit and the antithesis was matter, there'll be this new synthesis of energy, which seems like matter and seems like spirit. To me, it's a mass-free, lawfully functioning energy.
Amit Goswami, I think you're familiar with him. He's a physicist, and he's a fine scientist. Teaches, I believe, at Oregon State up in Oregon. Has made this step. He's jumped over this chasm, and he's brought physics, the world that he's grown up and lived in, into this new concept you're describing. And Goswami says, literally, if we can face the reality of it, and recognize that everything in the universe is alive. It has consciousness, it has intelligence, it's a living entity, and we are simply a part of it. And he says, if you can understand that, you can go on into another realm of reality totally, and we can walk away from all of this separatism, this mechanism and all of that, and see ourselves as we really are.
And I think it's this real life energy that is the core of our longing for oneness, either oneness with ourselves, oneness with each other, oneness with the universe. That when we are in contact with that energy, we are one, and
we're whole.
We're whole.
We're whole,
and we know that we're all connected intuitively and intimately. There was an experiencer told me, the tunnels of light that many people report as their pathway to the ET realm. When he was in the tunnel of light, he had this overwhelming feeling that he was in the presence of the living. And he just kept saying, the living. And he didn't mean he was in a living organism, but the light was the living. And it was an overwhelming. Another one mentioned that when he was in contact with this light, that he was one. Mm-hmm. And he didn't mean, he said, no, I don't mean whole, I don't mean together, or any of these things. I was one. So I see that reconnection as individuals and, you know, as a society taking place over many decades and, you know, maybe even a century. And I feel, my research has led me to feel that the extraterrestrials are playing a role in that. That whatever other things, you know, may be going on, whatever agendas anyone may have, that helping human beings reconnect is the key to becoming members of this cosmic community or cosmic federation that many of us are aware exists, but seems so far away at present.
We were describing earlier, the two of us, about this sense of homesickness that we both have felt over the years, of longing for something again, whether it's out there or wherever. And I think that's that hunger you were describing, to be whole, mm-hmm. to be one again. Mm-hmm. That we're tired of being separate. We feel that we're lost out here somehow. Mm-hmm. And I think that explains the homesickness I felt, and I think we're on the path.
I think we are, and I think we're farther along than we think. And you know, another experiencer said that he was given this information that once that connection is made, the progress is so rapid that the technological advances are minimal compared to the advance that's needed to get back in touch with nature within and without ourselves.
And the graph just goes climbing straight up, doesn't it?
You know, the idea that the extraterrestrials are investigating human sexuality for
that's part of their agenda.
For the purposes of the hybrid program. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, in my work, I've come to see that there may be another thing that they're looking at. That the life energy in us expresses itself through love, and sexuality, through work, through creativity, through many different things. But the way it's regulated in our body is the sexual function is a regulatory function. It balances the energy, the balance that the great Eastern medical traditions talk about.
The tantric concept that they have.
Right, and the ancient Chinese and the Ayurvedic, mm-hmm. and even up to in the modern era, all the health traditions talk about that health is balance and health is equilibrium, mm-hmm. and a healthy sexual life is a key part of maintaining, you know, that equilibrium, that reaching out toward the world and mm-hmm. coming back and expressing love and receiving love. And so one of the things that I've written about in the book is that's one of the things that's wrong with us, you know, is that this part of our sexual function is interfered with when from childhood on. We have procedures such as now my mind is going. You know, we have circumcision.
Yeah.
Which is damaging, and whether it's routine circumcision in America or the radical kind of female circumcision that's so devastating. We also have sexual prohibitions for religious or ethical, cultural reasons. What these things do is they impede the natural flow of the life energy in the human being, and that has consequences. It has consequences. It makes people less independent, less clear thinking, you know, less willing to stand up for themselves, less self-confident. It diminishes their intellectual capacity. So it's a focused inhibition of the human organism, but its consequences are widespread. So I wondered if extraterrestrials were coming here and studying us, wouldn't that be one of the first things that they would notice? And might not they study human sexuality, not to create a hybrid race and reintroduce them into Earth to create a new society, but in order to understand where things go wrong. And
why are we so crippled?
Right, and why do we do this? What kind of animal does harm to its own offspring? I mean, if we were to remove it from ourselves, and so we didn't have our defensive feelings about it. And we were to see an animal in nature, and the instant that it gave birth, it began to do harm to its offspring. We would know there was something wrong with that animal, and we would try to understand what was it that was making that animal do that. And is that not perhaps part of what the extraterrestrial investigation of sexuality is here among human beings, and not entirely, you know, a genetic engineering, retooling, restructuring of humanity.
It could
program.
be that, or it could be all of the above. You know, it really.
Well, I'm adding it to the mix.
Yeah.
I'm not saying.
I'm sure it must belong there.
I'm not
Sure.
saying
I think
only
it's-
this.
I think
and
it's a
not
valid
that.
point.
And so, if human beings are going to become part of this cosmic community, we have to heal on many levels, and we can't ignore the sexual level, you know, for our own personal or religious or moral or ethical reasons. I mean, we have an enormous body of medical information just to look at that aspect of it, that shows how important happiness and love is, and its consequences when it's missing.
Exactly.
In terms of depression and anxiety and, you know, other kinds of you know, problems. And so if we're going to heal, we have to heal as holistically, and that this might be part of it. You know, it's an interesting thing that this hostility that has existed for a long time between mainstream science and ufology, to use that term. I think there's a wonderful irony taking place now in that mainstream science is making such progress that it itself is coming to sound a lot like ufology, which it has derided.
Physicists are speaking to theologians now.
Right, physicists, the science and religion are getting together, and mainstream astronomers and space scientists in particular are starting to do practical work with phenomena that were, you know, of great interest to people studying the UFO phenomenon for years. You know, to use just one example, the phenomenon of zero-point energy. There have been many different theories of how UFOs may operate, and one of which was that they use the energy of the universe. Of course, mainstream scientists laughed at this because until recently their view was that the universe was an empty vacuum.
And then they found dark matter.
And then they found dark matter, and they found that the universe is energy. And the Air Force and NASA are even funding research into applications to turn the zero-point energy or the vacuum energy into a motor source for space travel. And they know that if this were possible, the speed of light is no longer the barrier that it seems to be, that there's virtually no limit to travel in space, which eliminates one of the major obstacles of skeptics to the reality of UFOs, that it's every place is too far away to get here. We can't get there and they can't get here.
Well, that's already broken down in the laboratory with experiments recently that showed that the speed of light is not the maximum.
Right.
They've exceeded it in the labs, I understand.
Yes, that's exactly true. And so on the microcosm and in the macrocosm of the work that they do in NASA, they're now realizing there's a lot of work to be done before it can be achieved, but it's achievable. You know, it's a technical problem now because there's been a mind shift that's made this possible. Also, you know, it was felt until recently that we're the only show in town. This is it. Life is here, and the universe is filled with dead matter and various forms of kind of mechanical energy. But it's now known that that's not true. That we ourselves, our own space program, I think we found over 40 planets now. We found 3 or more solar systems. I remember reading in the New York Times, one scientist saying, it seems the universe may have thought of things that we haven't come up with yet.
Oh, what a profound statement that is.
Because
how humble that is.
Right,
yeah.
exactly. Because large Jupiter-like planets are closer to the sun than our planetary system.
Could there be something out there that we just don't know yet?
Could there be? So I think our own space science is going to bring us to answers to many of the questions that were first posed by people who are investigating the UFO phenomena, and I think a lot of debunking will fall by the wayside. You know, I have nothing against skepticism. If a person is an open-minded seeker of the truth, that way lies knowledge and truth. But it does take humility.
A debunker lives in a closed shop. He isn't interested in learning anything.
No, I mentioned in the book that the only people with certain answers about the UFO phenomena are the debunkers.
Yeah.
Everyone else knows that they have only part of the story, part of the picture, and that that together we may be able to piece something together and progress. But we'll never progress by not valuing the experiences of credible, sincere people. You know, we can't take everything simply at face value, but I think one of the mistakes that so-called skeptics make is they try to apply the wrong tools to understanding the experiences of people, whether they've seen something in the air or they've seen an object on the ground, perhaps with entities nearby, or they feel they've had a close encounter, an abduction, or as John Mackey uses, the experiencer. There is so much to be learned from listening to those people with an open mind.
Exactly.
That is completely lost if they're just dismissed because some tool that was devised to study the mechanics, of physics or the details of chemistry doesn't somehow give them some information about the living human being, and they just completely ignore the reality of the person's experience, and they lose what can be learned from that.
The analogy I've always liked is the one in France 200 years ago, where people reported meteorites falling, and the learned scientist at the French Academy says, nonsense, that's not what you saw at all. Stones cannot fall from the sky because there are no stones in the sky. End of argument.
Exactly.
And that was only 200 years ago.
Exactly. Or I think many people have quoted, I don't remember which Marx brother, but the false skeptics often sound to me like one of the Marx brothers says, well, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? Bob, one of the most fascinating stories of the whole UFO phenomenon is one of the least known stories, and that's the involvement of the scientist Wilhelm Reich in the investigation of the UFO extraterrestrial phenomenon. And in the, I think it was 1954-55, he came down from Maine to Oracle, Arizona, just outside Tucson, and he was doing a series of energy experiments that had to do with manipulating and shifting the movement of the energy field of the atmosphere. And his major purpose was to see if there could be any use in weather modification, if there could be usefulness in helping nature along in its natural processes toward creating rain. It turned out that while he was doing his experiments, he was under the observation of the United States Air Force, but he also seemed to be under the observation of the extraterrestrials themselves. And in his book, Contact with Space, he details the experiments that he did, the Air Force planes that were seen flying around, and the extraterrestrials that were in the area. And as a natural scientist, one of the things that Reich did when he came to the Oracle Tucson area was to learn about his environment. And he would drive during the day. He would drive I think it was a 60-mile radius he set up, and he would go to a different place every day, and he would observe the flora and the fauna, and he would talk to the people, and he learned about the history, and he would observe the weather patterns, but he also would observe the night sky. And on a series of evenings, he put out a still camera, and he kept the aperture open, and he took photographs that we would be familiar with as sky tracks. As the Earth turned and the stars moved, they leave an impression on the film. He was doing this as a natural scientist to apply the scientific method to the study of his environment. He wasn't looking for UFOs. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to observe the night sky over the part of Arizona that he was in, and to understand his environment. What happened was when he developed the photos and analyzed them was amazing, because the things that he found weren't reported at that time. I think they've been reported since later. In one of the Star Trek photos, he found that one of the fixed stars, was not a star at all. That its track was longer than the tracks of the other stars, and that should not be. And it also deviated from the course of the fixed stars by 2.5 degrees, and that should not be. So that photograph doesn't tell you what that object was, but it tells you what it was not. And it was not a star. And what it indicates is that something had positioned itself in the pattern of the fixed stars that was indistinguishable to the naked eye, but was picked up by this time-lapse photography. 2 other pictures that I use 3 of these pictures in my book because I think that they're very important. 2 other photos show UFOs appearing and blinking out and reappearing and blinking out. And in one photo, it appears in the middle of the photo, and it's there as a star track for a certain bit, and then it's gone. And in another photo, it appears toward the end of the time-lapse photo. And again, you see the track of the fixed stars, but you see this phenomena of UFOs blinking on and off, appearing and disappearing, that I don't think was reported very much in the early 50s. I know it was reported later. What also makes it significant is that when Reich was doing his energy work, I think I mentioned this before, he withdrew energy from what he was making an assumption were space machines to see if they used this energy that he called orgone energy, the cosmic energy. And he got a reaction from these space machines. They wobbled and the lights blinked and they seemed to withdraw. And then they came back, and he performed this operation twice, but he stopped because he didn't know how it was being taken by whoever was behind the operation.
Whether it was a hostile act or not.
Right. But when Reich was doing this work and the Air Force was observing, and apparently the extraterrestrials observing, he sent all of these reports to the United States Air Force. And what we know now is that these reports probably made their way far beyond the United States Air Force and Project Blue Book to the clandestine group that was gathering,
keeping the lid on
things. And so what I've often wondered is, what did this clandestine group play a role in the prosecution of Reich by the U.S. government? And we could see different parts of his energy work, how it would affect the pharmaceutical industry or different economic forces in the country. But was there an even deeper thing? Was there activity on the part of the clandestine group that has done so much to control and shape the information about the UFO phenomena for its own ends?
Why did that decent man end up dying in solitary confinement, for God's sake, in a federal prison?
That's right.
It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't at all, and I think I've talked to lawyers about this, and they sort of blow their top. They don't believe me. It's why he's the only person in America whose books were burned by a federal court order.
Yeah.
When I was a young man, that motivated me. I wanted to know what could possibly be in those books that would lead people at that time to destroy them. And what I found was, what was in them, to put it simply, was the path to reconnect with the life energy, which would allow us to reconnect with the cosmos, which would allow us to reconnect with the living beings who are coming here and apparently have been coming here for quite a long while.
Which would allow us to know who we are.
Exactly.
And they don't want us to know that. Michael, you mentioned a comment earlier that there was some kind of instinctive built-in defense mechanism that we all seem to have that armors us and keeps us from making that expansive jump into this other reality.
I did, and you know, what I meant, Bob, was it's not instinctive. It seems instinctive because it's so deep, but actually it's a socially acquired rigidity that we get, and it comes from how we interfere with the natural development of our infants. I mean, it can even begin in utero, and things can occur at birth and certainly occur afterwards. But we have many prohibitions for children. We have prohibitions on sexuality. We have prohibitions on movement. Swaddling clothes are a good example. And many people think swaddling clothes went out with the New Testament, but they're still widely used around the planet. It's these inhibitions, these prescriptions on movement, basically, of the newborn that cause the newborn to begin to become literally rigid, so the musculature becomes less mobile. As the child gets older, the world can be a very harsh place, and the child has to defend itself against the world, and it assumes certain defensive attitudes that make sense at that time, in that moment. And all of this is unconscious to the infant and the young child and the, say, school-age child. And then the situation changes, and that onslaught may or may not be there anymore, but the damage is done. Yeah. It's sort of as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. You can't...
You're scarred for life.
Scarred. You can't. You can develop a happy life for yourself. You can do the best you can, but because it's unconscious, people aren't even aware of it. I mean, many people think that their personality is their personality, but actually it's their defense against the world. And when they do some inner work, that mask goes away. You know, that defense softens, and their true self comes out.
That's what John Mack and Stanislav Grof are working with.
Right.
To open it up and bring it out and be human again.
Right, and so what happens when you have this rigid musculature, which manifests itself also in rigid attitudes and thinking, when you confront a powerful new phenomenon, such as the UFO or the extraterrestrial phenomenon, your defenses are brought to their peak, and you're not even aware that that's what's doing it. And my feeling about why this happens is that the energy of the universe, the energy of the extraterrestrial phenomena, is the energy that's bound up in your organism, and it excites the person. But instead of the excitement being able to be free-flowing and moving and lead to creativity and productivity, it's bound by this armored musculature, and it creates anxiety, and it also creates rage and hatred. And these are tremendous obstacles in the way to getting in contact with the life energy in yourself and therefore outside of yourself. And they form tremendous obstacles in the way to any kind of openness toward understanding the phenomenon that we call UFO extraterrestrial. I feel that it's at the heart of the resistance to this new knowledge of this new world, and it's at the heart of the fear and the hatred of new knowledge, profound new knowledge in general.
I get the feeling, Michael, that you feel basically pretty optimistic about what you've been seeing and what's taking place.
I feel optimistic in the long run. I think if you focus on the short run and you see the devastating things that are true, the ecological holocaust or the harm that we do to one another, I think it would be very easy to despair. But I think if you look at it in the long term, I think we're going through an extremely difficult period, and the outcome is not certain. But I think life is far stronger and far more durable and far more flexible than all the anti-life forces that are active on Earth today. And I think that life will prevail. And as an expression of life myself, I have great confidence and great hope.
I continually quote at the end of my presentations a line that Leo Tolstoy had years and years ago. He said that there is a spark, a light of some kind, that burns brightly within the heart of man. He says it is a light that will not go out, no matter how dark the world becomes. And I leave my audiences very often with that in mind, that there is a light that will not go out, no matter how dark it becomes. And so I, after all of my life, and a number of wars, and a lot of heartbreaks, I try to believe and hold in my heart that that light will never go out, and that makes me optimistic. And I feel hopeful about what we've discussed today here and all that's taking place. But I have one last question for you.
Yes.
Where do we go from here?
What
happens next?
Well, I don't know how long it will take, but I hope that we go out there. You know, I hope that what happens next is that we take care of our side of the street, that we fix up things here on planet Earth.
Clean our garage and basement, so to speak.
Exactly, and that we do a better job taking care of our children and loving them and nurturing them. And I can't say that my generation has done a particularly good job, but I think we can do better in the future.
I think your generation did better than mine.
And I hope the next one, you know, will do that. And my hope would be that there would be direct contact between whoever these beings are, and
overt,
and ourselves, and that we could have humility, and that we could see, you know, that we're the students, and there's nothing the matter with being a student.
You know, humility seems to be one small thing that is missing in many of our modern mechanistic scientists. They don't seem to have that sense of humility. They've forgotten what Socrates said, that the mark of a truly intelligent man is one who realizes how little he knows. And you're right, I think humility is a major factor. And I'm seeing a bit more of it, hopefully, with men like Goswami. They're being listened to and paid attention to.
Yeah, well, I think there's a new generation, the children of the future, and they'll be the ones, I think, who will carry this forward. In the book, I say that as an example, our going out into space is analogous to the creatures that first came out of the sea a billion years ago or so. And after a billion years of exploring space, life will be so fantastically different from what it is today, just as life today is fantastically different from those first creatures that came out of the sea and crawled onto land.
Compare the difference between the life of the butterfly and the chrysalis. I use an analogy that the human species today is a chrysalis fighting its way out of the cocoon. And we are just about to get out there, and we're going to spread our wings and fly. And I like to feel, and it's maybe my own little idea, but I think that is our destiny out there, Michael. I think space, time, that infinite, incredible, glorious universe is our destiny. I think that we have a rightful place out there. And I believe we're going to go.
Well, I agree with you, and I have a feeling I may go there, not necessarily in this form, but I wouldn't be surprised if we found ourselves bumping into each other somewhere out there in the cosmos.
Would you be surprised if I told you that you've already been there?
I would be.
And the reason you feel that sense of homesickness is that you recognize that you've been there and seen that before. And you're going there again. And the human race is going there together. And we will indeed all run into each other again.
Well, I hope that's true.
Michael, I must tell you that I thoroughly enjoyed the little time we've had together this afternoon. I thoroughly enjoyed your book. I do think it's a major work. And I wish you were given more respect and recognition for this book. But I'm going to tell all of our viewers that this book is a must on your bookshelf. And I hope this is not the last. I want to see more from you.
Oh, well, thank you. I hope so. I hope so. And I'm going to just keep working and keep putting the message out and contributing, you know, my part as best I can.
Well, you've done a...
And how did we get here, and what is life about, are extremely important. But also for me, the question is, what's wrong with us? You know, what ails mankind? I think that must be one of the things that if non-human intelligences are observing us and our life here, or they are intimately involved in our life and perhaps have been for tens of thousands of years. You know, what is wrong with us? Why are we so divisive? Why are we so warlike? Why do we have dreams of paradise and dreams of God and brotherhood and sisterhood, but we can't live it? And in the book, I did, in the beginning and the end, try to focus on what non-human intelligences would see if they looked at us, and what we would see if we really looked at ourselves as how we truly are, and not as how we would like to
there's an old
present
adage
ourselves.
about if you could only see yourself as others see you.
Yeah.
Try to see ourselves as they might consider us. You know, that's a good way to approach it.
And you look at our you look at our behavior. One of the things that struck me is it's increasingly on people's minds is that, the ecological holocaust that we are now creating. I think there have been 5 previous great mass extinctions in the history of planet Earth, and we're well into the 6th great extinction now, and we are the cause.
Yeah.
It's not a meteor eliminating the dinosaurs. There was just a story in the paper this morning. It was a tiny little story that the first of, I think there are 602 primate species, they said, or 608, and I think a West African primate species has been declared extinct. And the article went on to say that they expect 10% more within the next 20 years, and a further 10% are in danger of extinction.
No, that's terrible.
Now, if you were to come here from elsewhere, you couldn't miss that. Another thing that I discuss in the book is how we treat our own offspring, how we treat our own children. We have a very sentimental, nice view of ourselves, family values, and all of that. But yet, when you look at how we really treat our offspring, it's devastating. And so many of our problems on Earth come from the damage that we do to our own newborn infants. When an infant's born, an infant brings a bit of the cosmos organized as an intelligent, living energy system onto our planet. Exactly. Yeah. But how we treat it is very disheartening, and it lays the foundation for many of the destructive and self-destructive behaviors that we see, in humanity.
I've tried over the years to try to look at the world as they might see us, and I look at Rwanda, the genocide. I look at Yugoslavia and some of the heartbreak over there, and I really begin to think, do we deserve to make it as a species? Are we orchestrating our own demise? We talk about extinctions. Maybe we're going to orchestrate our own extinction. It's a possibility that rather makes my blood run cold.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a serious possibility. One of the, I also, other than the book, I write a column for UFOcity.com on the web, and I've interviewed Native American myths where people feel that their tribe was seeded from other stars, or an African tribe. I think the Dogon feel that they were seeded from the star Sirius, and the great ancient Greek philosophers all believed that it was absurd to think that life existed only on our planet, and most of them believed that while there wasn't life on every heavenly body, that certainly there was life on many of them. And you can follow this train of thought from antiquity up to the present. So it's a fascinating topic.
Well, once you get involved with it, it grabs you and it won't let you go. That's what's happened to me. I remember when I first ran into a series of slides from a French researcher many years ago, Leroy Goret, and he had gone into some of the caves in the south of France and northern Spain. And in some of these caves, the drawings on the side of the caves, and some of those drawings are masterpieces. They're beautifully done. There are pictures of UFOs. And I mean, they're as clear and as vivid and as obvious as they can be. These have been dated over 20,000 years. Now, when you stop to think about that goes back quite a while.
It does, and I think it was Greenwood and Fawcett in their book Clear Intent who mentioned that there was a book the Air Force was using until it was discovered. They were using it, Introductory Space Science, and there was a chapter on UFOs. And while the Air Force was telling the public that this was hoaxes and misidentifications.
They were teaching the cadets what really was
right,
going on.
And one of the things they were teaching them was that the UFO phenomenon is apparently global and has been going on possibly for 50,000 years.
I'm convinced of it, and I think maybe it may go back even farther than that. I think as not only is it the greatest story never told, but I think that the UFO phenomenon itself, if it were just the fact that we're being visited by intelligences from somewhere else, coming here in little ships of one kind or another, if it was just that aspect of it, I think the story would have been released many, many years ago. But as you have learned, and I learned over the years, there's more to it than that. When you really begin to dig into it, you find out that this has implications about the origin of the human species. And I've read most everything Zecharia Sitchin has written, and I know you're familiar with his work. And Sitchin has clearly stated that we are very likely a hybrid species, that were genetically manipulated, maybe 100,000 years ago at least, into being what we are, Homo sapiens. And when you get into an area like that, you're treading on some rather difficult areas.
Oh, we definitely are, but lately there is knowledge coming from paleontology and from the mainstream science that's studying our human ancient history from 30, 40, 50,000 years ago. And that's starting to sound very much like Zecharia Sitchin and others in the field of ufology. And to me, that's very exciting when you find information put together by serious researchers from different disciplines, and they all start to dovetail.
Oh, they all come together, yeah. You know, Zecharia is not the only one that's written on that area. He's the most famous. There's a brilliant scientist in England by the name of Christian O'Brien.
An open-minded seeker.
It's an honest place
to
start, yeah.
Right, and so the feeling of the book for the reader is it's not a book that tells the person what to think. What I've tried to do is give the spectrum of opinion from a number of people who have been investigating this field for a long time, to show that it's a serious subject, that there are serious people with differing points of view, all agreeing that it's a real phenomenon, and give the reader information so that he or she can make up her own mind. And really the goal of the book is to help you think for yourself.
Well, I think you've done a fine job of that. That's the one thing I took from it that impressed me, and I've been hyping your book now.
Well, I appreciate that.
For at least 2 years.
I appreciate that.
Every time I go to a conference and I speak, as I may have shared with you last night, I prepared a recommended reading list. I have no patience with people who don't do their homework. Now, people have a right to an opinion, but when they voice an opinion and they're skeptical and they even go into the realm of being a debunker, and yet they've never done their research and their homework, I have no patience with that. I guess the old command sergeant major that's in me, you know, I'm ready to punch him out or grab him by the shirt or something. But I am honored and pleased that you've done such a thorough job. And I'm going to push this and push this.
Well, thank you.
And I understand that this is now coming out in paperback.
Yes, it's just a couple of months ago it came out in a paperback, and so I think it did well enough in hardcover. And it seems to be a kind of book that's has a life of its own. What do they say in Broadway theater? It has legs.
Yeah.
So it seems to, I get calls to do radio shows, and the publishers get letters, and it seems to really be taking a hold. And I was pleased that when the book is available in bookstores and it's in the general nonfiction section,
it sells out.
It sells out, and that was my hope, was that people who may not have given this subject much thought at all might be interested in this look at it, and then they would come to see that it's a very important subject.
Well, I don't know how much you know about my background. I mean, we've shared a few things at dinner last night, but when I first got into this thing, I was a skeptic. I was not really convinced of anything. Once I really began to research it, and I've been into this thing now for well over 30 years, Michael, I've concluded that this is not only the greatest story of our time, but very likely the greatest issue in the history of the human race. Yet this issue, this phenomenon, what it means, the implications of it, are going to change our world forever.
Well, I think when it becomes known to the large number of people on Earth that we're not alone and that we're actually probably part of a cosmic community, there won't be anything that remains the same as it is today.
Oh, nothing will ever remain the same.
And it's in my studies as a younger person, one of the things that struck me was that this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, I focused on what's called the modern era, because most people are aware of that now. But this story of life beyond Earth is one of the oldest stories in human history. And you can go back thousands and thousands of years in almost every culture, and you find people have been asking and sometimes answering these questions in the affirmative as to whether we're alone or not. You find
My next guest in this series is a professional medical health and science writer from New York City by the name of Michael Mannion. Michael has been a professional writer for 25 years. In 1998, he came up with a book titled Project Mindshift, which I, for one, consider to be probably the single most authoritative book on the subject of UFOs and the alien presence that I have ever read. The book is objective, it's thorough, it's honest. I've written a number of adjectives to describe this thing. It's stimulating, powerful, challenging, and there are parts of it that I consider absolutely brilliant. It's my honor and my pleasure to welcome to this series, the series I call UFO Insiders, Michael Mannion. Michael, nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, let's begin. I got a lot of things to talk about here today and many things to ask you. How long have you been interested in this phenomenon?
I guess I've been interested for about 30 years.
30 years?
30 years when I was a college student. And it was actually the study of life energy that brought me into contact with the UFO phenomenon. And I didn't expect that when I began that study. I was studying what we now call complementary or alternative medicine. I was studying a form of energy medicine. And as I followed the progress of that through one particular thinker, Wilhelm Reich, it led me to surprisingly, to the UFO phenomenon itself.
Well, you've done some thorough homework, and I admire that. One of the things that I have always had a little patience with are the critics and the debunkers and the skeptics who've never bothered to ever really do any research in the subject. And it's refreshing to me to have someone like you who is a professional writer that's looked at this thing and for the first time has taken an overall, what I call a historical overview, and looked at it honestly and objectively.
Well, I tried to look at the bigger picture because it is a serious topic, but it's too often covered through fiction or science fiction or comedy, or it's made fun of and made to appear goofy somehow. But yet it involves, I feel it involves the very core of life itself, and that it's an extremely serious subject, and it's part of an evolutionary process that we're going through. And so in the book, what I hope I've accomplished is to be a true skeptic, which is a...
That's written a series of books on the very same thing. He translates cuneiform. And I have a couple of his books, and they tell essentially the same story. You know what interests me, however, is that the implications with religion, this is a sensitive area. And I think that's one of the things our government has addressed from the very beginning. When you consider that the human race, and perhaps every major religion on the planet, has its origins in some way with these visitors, that gets into some delicate ground.
Well, I was just on the radio yesterday morning, and this topic came up, and all of our religions at the core are actually basically the same. They teach the same values.
The same basic philosophy.
That we're one, that we're one family, and that we must, care for one another and help one another, and that in one way or another, love is the primal force of the universe.
That's the bottom line, as they say.
And yet, there's an old Buddhist saying, everyone knows the soft overcomes the hard, and the weak the strong, but nobody knows how to live it. And in our world, the religious conflicts and the political conflicts prevent people from living the truths of their various faiths or their various ethical beliefs.
One of the things that I have disliked and spoken out very honestly about is the term alien. I don't like that word. The word alien to me divides people. It's a very divisive term. And you talk about they're aliens. Well, who the hell is alien? We talk about Mexicans who come across the border illegally as being aliens. The idea of a word alien is us and them kind of thing. It divides people.
That is, that's our MO, unfortunately, in many ways. In the book, I tried to use non-human intelligence as sort of a neutral
That's a
kind
good
of term. And
it's a broad term. It applies, I think.
Since we certainly, if there's anything that we can agree on, it's that most of the phenomenon is unknown. And I thought it would help me avoid being like one of the blind men in the parable of the blind man and the elephant. One's holding the tusk and he thinks that's the elephant, the other's holding the tail and he thinks that's the elephant. But we do know they're non-human, and we do know that there's an intelligence behind the phenomenon.
Over the years, we've learned a great deal about them. As a matter of fact, in my latest presentation in San Jose, I changed the subject of my presentation. I no longer speak about UFOs. I mean, that's a given. Anyone who's taken the time and trouble to do research knows that that's a reality. Unidentified flying objects are not unidentified anymore. We know what they are. We simply don't know who's in them and what their agenda is. But we know they're there. So I talk now, and I focus primarily on trying to come to terms with them. Try to see us as they might see us. How do we see ourselves? How do we see them? Are we afraid of them? Are they afraid of us? I think we need to look at it that way. How would they consider us, for example?
Well, I think that's one of the themes of Project Mindshift. I put forward the historical view to demonstrate that there are credible people, and that there's a considerable amount of solid information, so that you can see that there's a reality here. But the questions of who are we,